I want to begin by thanking everybody for coming here to the Architects of Change Live to listen to my cousin Patrick Kennedy talk about his best-selling book, A Common Struggle, and really to talk about his life through the mental health journey, addiction, and beyond. I want to thank all of you for agreeing to the intentions that you agreed to before you came. It's really important that we're a community that comes to these conversations with open hearts and open minds, that we come to this conversation without judgment, that we come to these conversations believing that we are, in fact, architects of change and that we see ourselves as the solution, that we don't see ourselves as bystanders. I know you also all committed to being part of the political process, and what I mean by that is agreeing to vote and how important that is, because that's all it all wraps up into the fact that we all believe that we can do something about our country, our families, our community, and ourselves. So I want to thank you for agreeing to those intentions, for coming here, for passing on about these conversation series. I told Patrick this sold out really fast, and we could have done it in a bigger venue, which tells me that this issue is so important to millions and millions of families all over the world. And this is going to be a podcast, and it's also going to be put up on mariashriver.com. We have an excerpt of Patrick's book up on there now. And I'm going to try to do this interview as though I'm just a detached journalist and not someone who actually lived a lot of what's in that book and watched a lot of what's in that book. And what's kind of interesting to me is that even though I lived it alongside of him, I watched it, I didn't know what he was actually going through until I read this book. And I think that that's such an important point, that we can have people in our own lives, in our own families, and think we understand what they're going through, and actually we have no idea. So I want to begin by thanking Patrick for making time to be here and for his extraordinary bravery in using his life and his experiences to help others, because that's really what this book is about. And that's not easy, right? These are tough issues, they're tough conversations, and they bring up a lot of shame, a lot of embarrassment, a lot of guilt, and a lot of fear. And so let me begin, Patrick, by talking about what has been the reaction. How have you felt about putting this all out there, and what has been the response?
Well, thank you, Maria. I want to say how grateful I am. This is not the normal interview where you start welling up when you look at your interviewer. But I have in my book several stories about Maria being there for me at very important times of my life. When my father passed, I'll never forget her saying, "You go right in that hearse with your father and be with him and see the response of how many people loved him, and you should know that, and you should be where you're supposed to be." I remember saying that. You said that, be where you're supposed to be, and I'm like, it was like really a terrific moment. And I remember also, and I wrote in the book, when in the New York Times, there was a story about Congressman Ramstad and I, who were the primary sponsors of the law that says that we ought to cover the brain as an organ of the body. And we had to fight real hard to have the Congress and President acknowledge that the brain was part of the body, and that insurance companies ought to actually reimburse for brain illnesses like they would any other physical illnesses. But in order to give that momentum a little lift, obviously I told some of my story, because of course in this society, if you show some gossip and some scintillating, prurient aspects of your life, there's a lot more eyes on the story. And so I told a little bit about my own family struggles, which weren't all that secret, but it was a big deal that any member of our family had actually talked about them. And I was getting a lot of blowback from my family, most notably my late father, who was very, very upset. And he was in a vulnerable place at the time. He just lost his sister, my Aunt Pat. And he went around the wake and was saying how awful it was that on the front page of the New York Times that day, I had, of course I'd done the interview like 2 weeks before, and of all days they ran the story. It ended up being on the day that my Aunt Pat passed away. And I was so vulnerable, and my cousin Anthony, Maria's brother, came up to me and said, wait, Maria you can't believe what Maria just said. And I said, well, what's going on? Well, when your father got to her and said, isn't this awful? Maria said, I think it's fantastic.
There was silence. I don't think Teddy, your dad, spoke to me for a while, but that's okay. But I think that Patrick, this is a book that's obviously very personal, but it's also very political. And when he was just saying that he fought for a really long time in the Congress to get the brain realized as, considered as part of the body, people were laughing. But that has been really your life's work. And to get it covered so that you can go and get your therapy covered, that you can get your medication covered, is because he worked like that. How tough was that, and where do we need to go with that?
Well, thank you, Maria. The fact that I got to be the primary sponsor should tell you something about stigma, because, it should have been like someone with a lot of gray hair and who'd spent a lot more time in Congress and who was in a leadership position. The way Congress works is in society and in business, the senior people get to call the shots. And if they want their name first on an important bill, if it had been something about, positive child care, supporting veterans, everybody would have been falling all over themselves to put their name first, right? If it had been for cancer, there would have been a list a mile long, and it would have noted all the senior members of Congress. So it says something that as the youngest member of Congress from the smallest state in the country and in the minority party, I got to put my name first. And I literally thought I'd be lucky if I made it in the top 100 signatories of the bill, because that's before I went to Congress as in the state legislature, and we'd sign up. And the clerk said, if you want to be the sponsor of the bill, it's yours. And I said, there must be some mistake here. You must have not checked. So that tells you a lot about, and then we worked on it for over a dozen years in a bipartisan manner, by the way. I just want to make that clear, because this does affect both Democrats and Republicans pretty equally. And we really didn't get it passed because there was some outpouring of support for this, Maria. Like there was some great groundswell where the American people said, we demand that mental health, like one of the most important aspects of our nation's actual health, be included in health care. That's not the reason the bill passed. The bill passed because our friend Chris Dodd figured out an ingenious way to put the $700 billion TARP, Toxic Asset Relief Program, bailout of our nation's banks into our bill, H.R. 1424, the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act.
That's why it's important to vote. That's why it's important to vote. But Patrick, talk about how important, the stigma still is. You're saying, you got to put your name on it, and that just tells you that people didn't want to put their name on it. People don't want to talk about this subject. So when you're talking about it, people are like relieved, horrified, shocked, gossipy. But by and large, people are coming up to me saying, this is in my family. And how do we get rid of the stigma?
Well, first of all, we don't realize how many people have our story, because all of us have our story. That's why I call it a common struggle. And I don't mean that all of us have a diagnosable mental illness in our family, although many of us do, including addiction and alcoholism. What I mean is that none of us feel comfortable talking about issues where a family member, is acting in a way that is disruptive to the family dynamic And it's a result of their being unconscious to the fact that they have perhaps a diagnosable mental illness or addiction, and the disruptive effect that has on the whole family. And then everybody clams up and nobody talks, because to do so would bring shame on the family, because the thinking is that people voluntarily act this way. The thinking is that I got up every morning and, ran through my life in a way that in parts of my life alienated you from me in ways that were very hurtful to me, because I knew that I owed you an amends, and I didn't know how to make it because we didn't talk about things, because these aren't issues you talk about. And that is the code of silence. And it doesn't matter what the diagnosis is. The consistent piece of this is the fact that none of us wants to discuss it because it's too uncomfortable. Now, I don't know, Maria, how we get past that. And frankly, this book is a tell-some, not a tell-all. And it's because I still feel that, can't talk about that. People won't understand. They'll make judgments of me and my family. I can't afford that,
Patrick, talk about it. Is it we don't talk about it because we want to keep a secret, or we feel shame or guilt, or do we not talk about it because we don't know how to talk about it? This is not something that we're taught how to talk about it.
So I know there's a number of our nation's heroes here, those who've served our country in the military. Would they please put their hands up?
There's a lot of vets here.
A lot of veterans. So I went to a place where I thought it was the least likely that I would hear about mental health issues. I went to the John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center in Fort Bragg, North Carolina. And this is where the best of the best are. And I got a tour, and the general at the time said, Congressman, we have our special forces have access to more mental health than any other branch of the military. And I'm like, General, listen, I know I care about mental health, but don't give me this applesauce that you think these special forces need mental health. They jump out of planes, they swim under the water for 5 miles without breathing. They come out on the beach and they speak 5 languages. They take out their target and they're reading to their kids by dinner time. They don't need mental health. And the general stopped me short and he said, Congressman, we don't see mental health the same way you do. And I'm like, enlighten me. And he said, we see mental health as a force multiplier.
What does that mean?
And that's exactly what I said. He said, we want to make our best the best they can be. We want to optimize all of the millions of dollars we spend training them so that when they have Osama bin Laden in their sights, they're not having any other thought intrude in their mind that could divert them from their mission. And I'm like, oh my God, that's so powerful. Imagine if we grew up in a society where it was celebrated how strong your mental health was, that we all sought to improve our social and emotional development, that we all bragged on our coping skills and our ability to manage stress in our lives. Imagine if that was the moniker, because we're Americans. We all want more and more and more. We want to look better. We want to be better, everything. And yet we haven't made mental health part of that competition as Americans in terms of our striving to get something that is perceived to be what we all should want.
But Patrick, bring us back to, because so many of the vets and Bobby, my brother, and your cousin is working so hard to get them the mental health that they need. And they talk a lot about post-traumatic stress, women in the military go through all other kinds of issues, and we're going to talk about that. But I want to bring you back to kind of the issues of mental health in our families. So many people here and talking about it as a family. So many people struggle with kids who have addiction, who have issues that parents aren't really adept at understanding. You go to a teacher and you say, my kid seems a little depressed. They say, that's normal childhood. That's a teenager. Don't worry about it. A kid goes off to college, doesn't call you back. You think that's kind of normal. And then they develop all kinds of emotional and mental health issues. And then you spend a lifetime and a fortune trying to figure out what's the right medication, what's the right diagnosis, how do you support it, do you draw boundaries, do you let them in, do you let them out, how do you talk about it as a family? What is, give us a tool, give us a tip, give these parents and people an idea of how to handle this in our families.
Well, first, the reason I came at it from the political and policy angle is that this is uncomfortable for everyone to talk about, but if you put it in the context of how we treat other chronic illnesses where there's family education, if you have diabetes, the healthcare system reimburses for the test strips, for the medication, for the wraparound services, because it's really seen as something where we want to treat this. We know it's a chronic. We don't want you to get off, too much on the sugar. It's going to affect. And yet with the mental illness and addiction, we wait until you're having to have your legs amputated or you go blind, basically, before the medical system kicks in to pay for any kind of care. My point is that I don't think, Maria, we're ever going to get our culture to change fast enough. And I know there are a number of attorneys here who have litigated this parity law very effectively. There has to be liability here to get the system to change. Now, the Civil Rights Act didn't change people's attitudes in many respects towards minorities in this country, but it made it illegal for them to overtly discriminate against them. And so what I think is we need to make sure we enforce the law as the mechanism so that people can say, did you get your checkup from the neck up? Make it normal, like in the healthcare system. What do you mean your insurance carrier isn't reimbursing for a screening of depression and anxiety and addiction? I mean, that should be essential as part of our healthcare assessment as to where you are and where you need to be. And that's easier for people to talk about, Maria, about, well, did the healthcare system reimburse it? And they should, and it's the law. As opposed to, do you feel comfortable talking about it? Because if we fight this fight just on a cultural level, it's going to take a long time, I think.
But it has to start.
I don't want to be too downer on it.
Well, but I think it starts, you talk a lot in the book about being misunderstood, about feeling alone, about your brother who had cancer and everybody stepped forward to try to help him because he had cancer. But you who were suffering from depression, loneliness, addiction, no one stepped forward to help you. No one knew how. That's what I want to get at. If you, knowing what you know now, go back to your 14-year-old self, go back to your 12-year-old self. What could your parents have done that they didn't do? What did you want them to do? What did you want me as a cousin to do?
So, but going back to my point about
stick with my point. You're an architect of change, but I'm the interviewer and I'm the older cousin, so do what I say.
The legal and political architecture of change is
and personal.
My asthma doctor, Dr. Scanlon, would have part of his healthcare system in his EMR, electronic medical record, would have said, okay, let's take a family history because we need to treat Patrick. And like they do with cancer, so they can screen me for cancer because Teddy had it, my mom had it, my dad had it, my sister had it. They screen. Or high blood pressure or cardiovascular disease. They screen for it. But if you screen for mental illness in your family, or you screen for other biomarkers like the adverse childhood experience, which was a Kaiser-funded longitudinal research project that identified that if you come from a family where there's violence or whether one or more of your parents suffered from a mental illness or addiction, or you heard gunshots, or you lived in abject poverty, there is a correlation between those indices, and if you add up and there's 3 or more of those indices, then the correlation is even stronger. Just on a scientific basis, Maria, insurance companies are going to pay for that because they know, oh my God, on a biomarker test, Patrick shows enormous risk, for ending up in trouble if he's not closely managed, particularly during the vulnerable years of his adolescence. And then, so that's what I'm saying.
So you would like, when you had asthma, it would have been better had they looked and said, wow, your mother is struggling with alcohol. Her mother struggled with alcohol. Let's look at your dad. Does he drink? Was there any trauma in his family?
Correct.
And then they would have looked at you and said, asthma might be what you're showing,
That's right.
but let's monitor you because you might start to drink at 10, which you wrote about in the book. You might start to develop some anxiety. Is that what you're saying?
That's perfect.
Okay. Okay. So I think it's really important to, it's important to know your family history. So if there are parents in the room, when they look at their child and maybe they have depression and maybe they have anxiety, and they look at their kid and think there might be a connection here. And I think the other thing that's really also important in the book, you talk about that so often kids who end up with addiction or depression or anxiety or alcoholism, parents feel it's their fault. And we as a society often blame the parent. We see all these mass shootings and we think, where are the parents? We see kids who are angry, we think, where are the parents? And you very, I think, smartly, you talk about that this is not the fault of a parent. What is the connection between the parent, the home, and the child experiencing these issues?
Well, first of all, they're family illnesses. There's no way when one member of the family is suffering that it doesn't affect every other member of the family. And yet our system of care is to treat the individual in a vacuum without understanding the dynamic of their family when they have to go back to that family dynamic. And if you haven't identified or sought to address that, then you're going to have a much tougher time for that person to succeed. I could go into the Foundations for Learning Act, which basically said if a parent suffering from an addiction, you think that child's going to have any chance of graduating from high school, you're going to be mistaken. They're going to have a much tougher time. Why don't we address in a holistic way the family issue if we want those kids to excel in school? And when you've got most urban centers with 40% dropout rate, and that's a big challenge for our nation in terms of its collective strength to have so many dropouts, ignoring the family unit is going to be done at our peril. So now I've forgotten the question you asked me.
Okay, well that's good because I have a lot more, but I want to talk to you. We were talking about the family and connecting issues that parents might be experiencing and passing on to their children. You talk about in the book about that your dad had untreated traumatic stress and that he passed that traumatic stress onto you and your siblings.
That's right.
Talk about what that is, untreated trauma. That's really what you call it, untreated trauma, and how we as parents might be passing it on to our kids and how we can recognize untreated trauma. We hear a lot about trauma when it comes to vets. We hear about trauma, particularly with women and issues of domestic violence, but how does unprocessed trauma go from your father to you?
Well, I can't describe how that happens other than I think anybody who knows a parent who's suffered from something, how that affects them, going back to the family dynamic. Obviously, our family was enormously affected by gun violence, the murder of our uncles, and then the ensuing tragedy with my father killing a woman in Chappaquiddick, and the fact that none of us ever talked about any of that when, of course, we also lived public lives in addition to being a family that is, and like any other family. So the devastation emotionally was enormous, but we all kind of like happily kind of moved forward because our family ethic was to keep, your head down and keep moving forward. And yet, in so many instances in our family members have fallen down over the years, and some have died. And those, I think, are in part casualties to the enormous devastation and the trauma that took place in our family, by the way, which none of us have talked about in our families. I know I didn't with my father and mother. My mother had 3 miscarriages, and they were pretty late stage, and it's unfathomable the trauma and the grief that she went through. And of course, I talk about how she would just quietly shuffle to the room, and we would all be like waiting, holding our breath for the door to close, because none of us wanted to address the elephant in the room, which was that she was absolutely inebriated in the middle of the day while I had my friends over to play. And I was worried that their moms who came to pick up their friends would see my mom, because I internalized that if they did, the shame would pass to me, and I would feel, we can't have that happen. And I would try to guide her back to a room and then shut the door. It's just, and this is not uncommon for a lot of families. And I don't know, Maria, how you get past that kind of silence. Because the issue here fundamentally is, like in the AIDS crisis, silence equals death. There are people dying every day of silent suicides and overdoses. And it's a result of the fact that they are isolated and alone, because no one will hear no evil, speak no evil, see no evil, in that term of phrase, that there is someone suffering in their midst, because they first don't want to talk about it because it'll bring shame to the family, and 2, they don't think there's anything that they can do about it. So that's why I want to get to the healthcare system does have evidence-based interventions, and if the system paid for those interventions, we wouldn't feel like this was something we couldn't talk about, because I don't know what I'm going to do. Once I acknowledge that there's a problem, how are you going to get it? Nobody ever gets better, by the way. That's the attitude, when in fact the reality is there are proven interventions. People can get better. They can live with this as a chronic illness, like they live with any other illness as a chronic illness. So that's why I keep coming back to my point, which is the architecture of this is through the legal apparatus and the public policy apparatus, because otherwise, we could do these terrific forums all over the place and we would change hearts and minds. But the insurance companies, and by the way, the federal government is the biggest payer of all, would continue to act as they do unless someone's suing them or knocking on their door and saying this is illegal, and it doesn't make any sense.
That's why we try to connect, back to my point. This is how we grew up, okay. But to the personal drives the political. So if people feel that their story is important, that they can create change, that they can talk about it, just like you have used your personal to drive the political. And people, you talk a lot about shame and stigma and fear of talking about it. What has been the reaction for you in talking about things that made people in your own family uncomfortable? And so they look at you and go like, how'd it go? Yeah. How'd it go? Did you get accepted? Did everybody yell at you? Did you, are you more embarrassed? Are you more ashamed? What's the reaction? Because we're all afraid, like if we say, hey, by the way, I have anxiety, I have depression, I'm addicted, whatever, that people are gonna like, run the other way. So what's been the reaction?
Well, the reaction in the media is that my mom's, one of my mom's friends in recovery said, you can't tell, in your book you talk about your mother, that's her story, not yours. And then she released a press release to the press that said my mother never condoned the book, which is not true because I talk with my mother regularly, and she's always been supportive of my efforts. And with respect to my brother, I unfortunately still have not spoken to my brothers since about a month and a half before the book release, where I did give him a copy of the manuscript before it came out, and he had a chance to digest it. And then when the day the book was released, he put out a press release saying that I had distorted the story, and it's not the story that he recalled, which I understand. His story is different from mine. You know, he's 6 years older, and he may have had a different perception, and that's okay. But that's still part of the family dynamic, and I think things are going to work out ultimately. In terms of my feeling, okay, my wife's family was the big barometer because I live with them every day. Mm-hmm. Okay, and my father-in-law called me, and I know about him, you know, and I know that no one else knows about him because my wife has been very quiet about talking about his struggles and his family. And he talked to me, and he's like an old Irish guy like my dad. He didn't ever talk to my wife about anything. He got me on the phone after the 60 Minutes piece, and he said, "You did a brilliant job." This is a guy that doesn't talk, and so like I have a number of examples like that, which were enormously validating to me. And I've had a number of our family friends I would be horrified to see at a party because I'd be worried of their condemnation of me because I somehow told family secrets, embrace me, Maria, and said this was really something that was important, and your father would be very proud of what you've done. And
how do you think your dad
I write
book?
about in the book that, like, initially my dad did not feel comfortable about this. That was the first story I told here. But then I also told the story about how we were on the floor of the house when the bill was being marked up on the House side. And I also told about how our bill on the House side was much more generous in terms of its coverage than the more conservative, insurance-driven bill on the Senate side. And I have to say, my father had kind of taken over for Paul Wellstone, and it was really driven by Pete Domenici, who I give a lot of credit to advancing this thing. But Pete's primary focus was for people like his family who had a daughter with severe mental illness who were being discriminated against. And he just wanted to get something passed. And I saw this as, if we're going to pass something and we don't include everything, then we're going to be here in another 20 years trying to tuck in anxiety and depression and addiction. And he thought, well, you add those addicts and alcoholics to this bill, it's going to kill the bill. We've got some sympathy now for the people with schizophrenia, but you add those folks and, you know, you might end up killing the bill. I mean, that was literally the political trade-off. And I remember my dad being the architect that he was of so many important pieces of national legislation. He worked his magic on this bill and on me personally. Because how could you have ever imagined a day where my dad grew up, when I grew up and my dad kept saying all he needs is a good swift kick in the ass about me, to my brother, then negotiate with me to try to get my bill to be the compromise bill. And because he never talked about things, but he did it in subtle ways. And he patted me on the knee like said, we're going to get this done. You hold out and we'll be able to get a better bill. Meaning, don't compromise with me. That's what he was saying. Hold out and move the goalposts a little bit so that we can get more in the final bill. And then at the 11th hour, and then I'll shut up, Maria. The 11th hour, I called him. He was at home convalescing from his brain surgery. And I said, I need you to pull a rabbit out of the hat and get this bill passed, because if we pass this TARP bill, then we're all going to go home. We have to pass the parity bill in advance. And he said, call Chris Dodd. And that's when I called Chris Dodd, and Chris Dodd said, let me think about it. And then within a few days, the whole 700, closer to $800 billion bailout of all the big banks, which of course a lot of economic interest was behind that bill, was on the parity bill, H.R. 1424. Hence, it went to the president's desk.
Really great. I think that makes your point about the political and how important the personal to vote for politicians really who have your back and who have your interest, and not to give away your vote is something I always say. So vote for people who talk about issues that you care about and hold them accountable, because it does make a difference who is in Washington, even though we all want to complain about Washington. But I just want to come back also to, because so much of this is personal, and you write in the book about a letter that your dad wrote to you, and I think so many people spend their lives trying to make their parents proud, even when their parents have passed away. We're still striving and hoping, right? And when your dad ran for president, I worked on that campaign. I gained 40 pounds in Iowa, so I remember I ate my way through that campaign. But that he wrote, because there was some fear that what happened, that your dad might end up the way our other uncles did. So he wrote a letter to you about how he felt about you, to be given, if he was in fact assassinated, that would be given to you. And that letter then was given to you after he died. And I just thought that it would, to speak to a minute about what that letter said to you, where he told you that he loved you and he was proud of you, and that had been your motivator because you didn't think he was. And how important it is for us as parents to say that kind of thing. Not even those people who are parents, but who are in other people's lives, who are friends, to say these things while people are alive. How important is that?
Well, obviously, your question illustrates it is so important. These two letters that I got were amongst the most important letters that I ever got from my father, and I got them after he had died. As I said, as you mentioned, one letter I got from his former chief of staff from years and years before, who, after I had had some sobriety and I was married and looked as though I was a little bit more stable in my own life, he said, I feel I can give this to you now, and I have them in my possession, and I don't know what to do with them. And the thought that this fellow, who was like my dad's consigliere, he always was the guy that was supposed to manage these issues, would have entrusted me to take these letters and distribute them to my siblings and to my mother, because when he wrote them, it was, he was still married to my mother, was incredible. And he told me in the letter how much he loved me and I meant to him. And then the other letter, same thing. It was delivered when my brother and sister and I were greeting people as they came to my father's memorial at the JFK Library, and his casket was there, and there were people waiting hours and hours. My brother, sister, and I would take turns greeting people. And one of my father's former staffers from like 20 years, 30 years before handed me a letter, and my brother, we were standing there, and the letters to Cara, Teddy, and Patrick, open upon my death, in my dad's handwriting. And it was sealed. She said, I felt I had to give this to you. Well, I mean, what are we going to do? And Cara had just left, and Teddy and I called her and said, what do you want to wait till later and you come back and we'll all open it together? She said, no. Read it to me right now. And Teddy and I read the letter. And the letter was the most profound letter you could ever imagine. I mean, he said, nothing in my life has mattered more to me than you three children. He said, no other legacy is important to me other than you all be happy. I mean, who is this guy? I thought to myself. But it was my dad. He was that old Irish sentimental guy. And it was the reason so many people deeply, deeply loved and adored my father, his colleagues in the Senate and people that he met around the country, because they could identify with the fact that this guy was emotionally connected, even though he was so traumatized in his life. He understood what suffering was. He understood the basic essence of what we need in our lives, frankly, that he probably didn't get from his parents. And that was that total approval and love and acceptance. And he gave it to me in those 2 letters, ironically. And he also gave it to me when he hugged me. So I just want to say, you don't have to write a letter to your loved one, although letters are great, little notes are great, as you do, Maria, on real paper, not emails. But what's also important that I got was the physical embrace. My dad used to just kiss me, and we'd be in the Capitol, and we'd be in the ready for the State of the Union, and the president would be walking in, give me this big kiss and bear hug. And I know today I'm going to be kissing my children like that for the rest of my life because my dad gave me that, and I'll forever be grateful to him for that.
And I think, Patrick, that's so beautiful, and I think it's so important what you said, that really that when you read the letter, you were like, who is this person? And that so all of us have a facade and an interior truth. And I think one of the great takeaways from the book for me is how important it is in our lives to try to bring those two together, and to let our children and those that we care about in our lives to see who we really are, so that they don't get a letter and go, who's that? Right. And that really, that's kind of, to me, the bravery of sharing your story to ignite political change, to ignite personal change in families, to lift the lid and say, this is a common struggle for millions and millions of families, and to try to lift the shame. You talk about that your parents were both dominant and distant. Yeah. And I think that that's a thing that so many families go through, right? And I want to just kind of, and then we want to open up to some questions, but what could you say to schools who are dealing with these kids at such vulnerable times in their lives, who might have parents who are dominant and distant, who might have parents who don't ever write a letter, who don't say anything? How do they pinpoint? How do they bring them in? How do we create change on the front lines of people's lives young, so they don't have to have the incredible pain that you write about, the loneliness, the feeling like a loser, the feeling that you could never, that you were on the edge, you were in an undertow, and you would never come back?
Well, back to my point. I think if kids, before they go to school every year, in addition to checking their eyes and ears and whether they have scoliosis and whether they've gotten their immunization shots, we ought to screen them. And that ought to be standard fare. And that is resisted by a lot of folks because they don't want their kids labeled.
Screen them, what do you mean?
Screen them for anxiety, depression, at risk of addiction. You know, if you know that there's a family history or you know there's trauma in the home, apply the ACE criteria. Just do the ACE criteria, adverse childhood experience, so that you know what's going on at home. My wife's a school teacher, elementary school teacher. The kids that aren't turning in their homework, that aren't showing up, guess what? You know, the trauma going on in those kids' lives is unbelievable. She knows what's going on. She has nothing to do but to give the kid detention or send them down to the principal's office. That is all teachers have, essentially, as a toolkit to deal with kids that are having enormous struggles. We need to give schools more resources, and whenever you say that, people go, oh my God, you got to spend your way out of it. This is not, because we all know the economics show that you're not going to, do yourself any favors if you let these kids slide, because as that age shows, they end up in juvenile detention. If they're in juvenile detention, they're 80% more likely to end up in adult correction, and then they're in and out of the system. We're all going to pay. And years ago, you'd say, oh, that's just soft-hearted liberal stuff. Well, today, they have the PricewaterhouseCoopers economic analysis of this stuff because they track this, and they know it to be a fact that it costs our society. I hate to say, but it's the economic costs that are going to end up driving the change, not, the human costs of these kids losing and getting lost in the system.
And I think what's really also important is that very often educators and political leaders look to kids who are inner cities for trauma and stress and these issues. And I talk to parents all over this city and all over the country, and kids are reporting stress in high income areas, in, quote, families that look good on the outside have incredible stress on the inside. And so it's an education of doctors, as you said, of educators, of parents, and it all starts in the home. So Patrick, I love you, I admire you, and I respect you, and I'm so glad this book is a bestseller. I know your dad would be incredibly proud of you from up above, and we all are. So God bless, and buy his book. Thank you.